The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the park's green grass. Officer Gael Mendez was on his routine patrol, enjoying the quietness of the evening when something unusual caught his eye. A German shepherd was walking toward him slowly, its fur dusty and its eyes filled with exhaustion. But what truly struck Gael was that the dog was carrying something in its mouth, something small and fragile. As the dog came closer, Gael's breath hitched. Nestled carefully between the shepherd's jaws was a tiny puppy, barely a few weeks old. The larger dog stopped a few feet away and, with great care, placed the puppy on the ground. The little one let out a weak whimper, its tiny body trembling. But the adult dog didn't move away. Instead, it let out a deep, sorrowful whine, its dark eyes filled with something Gael could only describe as desperation. Gael crouched down cautiously, his hand resting on his belt. "What happened to you?" he murmured, keeping his voice calm. The German shepherd didn't run or growl, it just stared at him, almost pleading. The puppy, too weak to stand properly, tried to crawl toward him, but its tiny legs wobbled. The sight tightened Gael's chest. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was something more. Then, something unbelievable happened. The German shepherd, whom Gael would later name Thorik, let out a sound that made the officer freeze. It was a soft, heart-wrenching cry, almost like a sob. Gael had seen many things in his years as an officer, but never had he witnessed an animal expressing such profound emotion. This dog was begging for help. Gael hesitated only for a second before reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mendez. I need a veterinary unit at the city park immediately. I have a dog in distress, and I think something is seriously wrong here." As he spoke, he carefully picked up the tiny puppy, who nestled against his chest. The shepherd watched his every move, its body tense, as if waiting for Gael to understand what needed to be done. Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, Thorik's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the grass. Gael's grip on the puppy tightened as he stared at the fallen dog, his heart pounding. This was just the beginning. Gael's heart pounded as he rushed forward. He carefully placed the tiny puppy on the grass and reached out to the collapsed German shepherd. The dog's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Up close, Gael could see the signs of exhaustion: ribs slightly visible, dirt matted into his fur, and fresh scratches along his legs. Whatever had happened to him, it had been brutal. Yet, even in this state, he had carried his puppy to safety. Gael hesitated for only a second before gently resting his hand on the shepherd's side. "Hey, buddy, stay with me," he murmured, feeling the faint warmth beneath the dog's fur. The shepherd, Thorik, let out a weak whimper but didn't move. His ears twitched slightly at Gael's voice, as if he understood. The puppy, who had been placed beside him, nuzzled against its father, whimpering softly. The bond between them was undeniable. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens grew closer. The animal rescue team had responded faster than Gael expected. A white van pulled up near the park's edge, and two medics in blue uniforms hurried toward them, carrying a pet stretcher and medical kit. "Officer Mendez?" one of them asked. Gael nodded and stepped back, allowing them to assess Thorik. The shepherd barely reacted, too weak to fight. "He's severely dehydrated," one medic muttered, checking his gums. "And these wounds, some are fresh, but others look older, like he's been struggling for a while." Gael watched as they carefully lifted the dog onto the stretcher. The puppy let out a desperate cry, trying to follow, but its tiny legs couldn't keep up. Without thinking, Gael bent down and scooped up the small pup. The moment he did, the little one stopped crying, pressing its tiny head against his chest. "We'll take them both," the second medic assured. "They need fluids, food, and a full checkup. Do you know if they have an owner?" Gael shook his head. That was the biggest mystery. Where had Thorik come from? Why had he chosen Gael to approach? And, most importantly, What had happened to put them in this desperate situation? As the rescue team loaded Thorik into the van, Gael looked down at the puppy in his arms. The little one yawned, its eyes barely staying open. Something inside Gael stirred, a sense of responsibility he hadn't expected. He knew, at that moment, that he wasn't just going to walk away from this. The ride to the veterinary clinic was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whimper from the tiny puppy in Gael's lap. It barely moved, its small body pressed against his chest as if sensing safety. Next to him, Thorik lay motionless on the stretcher, and 4 now attached to his leg. His breathing was steadier, but his body remained limp, completely drained from whatever he had endured. Gael gently ran a hand over the puppy's soft fur, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just a stray. Something about Thorik's actions felt deliberate, almost calculated. He hadn't simply wandered up to Gael, he had chosen him. But why? Across from him, Ilara, the rescue medic, flipped through her clipboard with a serious expression. "He's been out there a while," she muttered. "Malnourished, dehydrated, covered in old wounds, and those fresh ones? They tell me he's been through hell. But the way he brought you the puppy? That's not normal stray behavior. That was a plea for help." Gael nodded, already pulling out his phone to check the missing pet reports. But as he scrolled through the list, his stomach sank. There was nothing. No reports matching Thorik. No record of a lost dog with his description. It was as if he didn't exist. As the clinic came into view, Gael tightened his grip on the puppy. The rescue team rushed Thorik inside, prepping him for treatment. Gael stood by the door, watching them work. Something about this felt bigger than just a lost dog. His instincts told him one thing: this was just the beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as the veterinary team worked swiftly to stabilize Thorik. The bright fluorescent lights of the clinic cast a harsh glow over the examination table where the German Shepherd lay motionless, his breathing shallow, his body limp. Gael stood nearby, still cradling the tiny puppy in his arms, his eyes fixed on the unmoving figure of the dog that had risked everything to get here. The soft rise and fall of the puppy's chest against his palm was the only thing grounding him in the moment. A vet named Dr. Rowan, a man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair and a calm but serious expression, adjusted the foreline in Thorik's leg. His hands were steady, experienced, but the slight furrow in his brow told Gael that the situation was dire. "He's in rough shape," Rowan murmured, his voice low but firm. "Severe dehydration, starvation, and these wounds." He carefully ran his fingers over a series of scars along Thorik's side before looking up at Gael. "Some of these are old. But the deeper lacerations..." He hesitated. "Those look like they were inflicted by a person." Gael's stomach tightened. Someone had done this to him? The idea made his pulse quicken, a wave of anger rising in his chest. Thorik hadn't just been a stray struggling to survive. He had been running from something. Or someone. And yet, despite whatever suffering he had endured, he had carried his puppy through it all. The thought made Gael's grip on the small creature instinctively tighten. If Thorik had been abused, had the puppy been in danger too? Had there been others? Dr. Rowan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he continued his examination. "We're giving him fluids, antibiotics, and pain meds, but he's critically weak. If he makes it through the night, he has a chance." His tone was professional, but Gael could hear the unspoken words beneath it. He might not make it. Gael had seen enough life-and-death situations in his career to recognize the uncertainty in the doctor's voice. The body could only endure so much before giving up. Had Thorik reached that limit? Gael exhaled, finally stepping forward to place the puppy in a small, warm enclosure lined with blankets. The tiny creature barely stirred, its breathing steady, exhausted from whatever it had been through. Thorik had protected him, fought for him, brought him to safety. Now, it was up to fate, and the veterinarians, to see if he would get a chance to recover. Gael wasn't sure why, but he felt a deep responsibility for them both. As the machines around Thorik beeped steadily, Gael pulled up a chair near the observation window. He wasn't leaving. Not until he had answers. Not until he knew the truth about this dog who had defied all odds to find him. And more than anything, he wasn't leaving until he knew whether Thorik would open his eyes again. The clinic's soft hum was punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the occasional shuffle of the veterinary staff, and the muffled voices of technicians working in the back. Gael sat near the observation window, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the lifeless body of Thorik stretched out on the examination table. The German Shepherd's breathing was weak but steady, his chest barely rising with each breath. The fore in his leg dripped a slow stream of fluids into his system, but there was no sign of movement. No sign that he was coming back. Beside him, the tiny puppy lay curled in the enclosure, buried in soft blankets, its delicate body twitching slightly as it slept. Gael found himself watching it almost as much as he watched Thorik. It hadn't made a sound since arriving at the clinic, its silence unsettling. Puppies were supposed to whine, to fidget, to seek warmth and comfort. But this one? It barely moved. It was too exhausted, too drained to even cry. Whatever had happened before Thorik found Gael in the park had taken its toll, not just physically, but emotionally. Gael had seen that look before. Not in animals, but in people. In victims. His thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open, and Dr. Rowan stepped inside, a tablet in hand. The veterinarian's face was set in a deep, unreadable expression. Gael sat up. "You found something," he stated rather than asked. Rowan exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "I ran scans for a microchip or any form of ID," he said, tapping at the screen. "Thorik has nothing. No records, no tags, no registration in any database." He glanced at the enclosure. "The puppy doesn't either." Gael gritted his teeth. That wasn't normal. Dogs like Thorik didn't just appear out of nowhere. His breed, his posture, his awareness, it all pointed to training, possibly even ownership. He had seen plenty of street dogs in his career, but Thorik wasn't one of them. Someone had raised him. Someone had let him suffer. Someone had hurt him. And now, there was nothing. No record of his existence, no trace of where he had come from. Like he had been erased. Gael leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. "Then we're dealing with an abandoned case," he muttered. Rowan hesitated. "Maybe. Or maybe something worse." His tone made Gael's muscles tense. He didn't like that. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something felt off. And this felt wrong. Dogs weren't just dumped like this, especially not ones like Thorik. And they certainly didn't carry their young into a park, delivering them into the hands of a stranger like they had a mission. Like they had a purpose. A sudden memory of the park flashed in his mind. The way Thorik had approached him, his body trembling with exhaustion but his eyes sharp, determined. He hadn't just stumbled upon Gael by accident. He had been looking for someone. And somehow, he had chosen Gael. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Thorik had survived something terrible, but his story wasn't over yet. There were too many questions, too many missing pieces. And if Gael had learned anything in his years as a cop, it was that survivors always carried secrets. Secrets that needed to be uncovered. And he wasn't walking away until he found the truth. Gael stood by the observation window, his arms crossed, eyes locked onto Thorik's still body on the examination table. The slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sign that the German Shepherd was still fighting. His breathing remained shallow, his body limp, but he was alive. For now. Gael had seen this kind of battle before. Not in animals, but in people who had been pushed beyond their limits, forced to keep going long after their strength had run out. A soft sound pulled his attention away. The tiny puppy shifted in its enclosure, buried in the warmth of the blankets, its tiny body twitching slightly as it slept. Gael had seen a lot of things during his years as a cop, but this dog, this small helpless creature, had already survived more than most. He didn't know how much it had lost, didn't understand the sacrifices Thorik had made to get him here. But Gael did. He had seen that kind of determination before. It was the kind that only came from someone who had lost everything. A sharp knock on the glass of the observation room made Gael turn. Dr. Rowan stood outside, motioning for him to step into the hallway. There was something in the vet's expression that made Gael's stomach tighten. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was concern. And that meant bad news. Gael had learned a long time ago that looks like that only came before a truth no one wanted to say out loud. "We found something," Rowan said the moment Gael stepped into the hall. His voice was low, serious. He held out a tablet, and as soon as Gael looked at the screen, his pulse spiked. It was a medical scan of Thorik's body, highlighting various injuries. But it wasn't the fractured ribs or the scars that caught Gael's attention. It was something small, metallic, and buried deep in the German Shepherd's shoulder blade. Gael's jaw clenched. "What is that?" "We're not sure," Rowan admitted. "It could be a tracking chip, a bullet fragment, or something else entirely. But one thing is certain, it's not natural. Someone put it there." He exhaled, tapping on the screen. Judging by the scar tissue around it, it's been there for a long time. Gael felt his fingers tighten around the tablet. A tracking device? A bullet? Something worse? His mind raced through the possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. This wasn't just a case of an abandoned dog. This was bigger. Someone had owned Thorik. Someone had marked him. Someone had let him suffer. And now, Gael had a new question burning in his mind. Who had left Thorik for dead? And more importantly, were they still looking for him? The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on Gael's chest as he studied the scan. The metallic object embedded deep in Thorik's shoulder wasn't just a remnant of a past injury. It was something deliberately placed. Something not meant to be found. His fingers gripped the tablet tightly, his mind racing through possibilities. A tracking chip? A bullet fragment? Something worse? No matter the answer, one fact was clear. Thorik had been marked. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Marked. Dr. Rowan's voice cut through the silence, steady but filled with tension. "We need to remove it," he said, tapping the screen. "If it's a chip, we might be able to trace it. If it's a bullet, it could tell us more about what happened to him. But whatever it is, it doesn't belong in his body." He exhaled, his expression dark. And judging by the scar tissue around it, it's been there for a while. Gael's eyes flicked toward Thorik's unconscious body, stretched across the examination table on the other side of the glass. The German Shepherd had already endured more than any living thing should. His body bore the evidence of a brutal past. Scars, fresh wounds, the kind of damage that didn't happen by accident. Someone had hurt him. Someone had left him to die. But instead of giving up, Thorik had fought, not for himself, but for the tiny life he had carried to safety. "How soon can you operate?" Gael's voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. Every second wasted felt like a risk. If this was a tracker, who else knew about it? Who else was looking for him? Rowan glanced at his watch. "Within the hour," he said. "But it's risky. Thorik's body is weak, and anesthesia puts him in danger. We'll have to monitor him closely." Gael swallowed hard. He hated the idea of taking that risk, but what choice did they have? Thorik had already risked everything. Gael owed him this much. He turned toward the tiny puppy curled inside its enclosure, wrapped in a blanket, breathing peacefully for the first time since Gael had found them. He let out a slow breath. Thorik had fought to bring this little one to safety. Now, it was Gael's turn to fight for him. He wasn't just here as a cop anymore. He wasn't just investigating some strange case. He was involved. And he wasn't going to let Thorik down. With one last glance at the scan, Gael clenched his jaw. Whoever had done this to Thorik had made a mistake. They had left him alive. And now, Gael was going to make sure they answered for it. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the small operating room as Thorik lay motionless on the metal table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The machines surrounding him beeped in slow, rhythmic intervals, monitoring every fragile sign of life. Gael stood just beyond the glass barrier, arms crossed tightly, his eyes never leaving the German shepherd who had somehow ended up in his care. The sense of urgency in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about saving a dog. This was about uncovering the truth. Dr. Rowan moved with precision, his gloved hands steady as he positioned the surgical tools beside Thorik's injured shoulder. "We'll start with a small incision," he said, his voice calm but clipped. "If this is a tracking device, we don't want to activate it. If it's a bullet, we need to extract it without causing more damage." His assistant nodded, handing him a scalpel. The sharp glint of the blade under the bright surgical lights sent a chill through Gael. He had seen many operations before, but none that felt this personal. As Rowan made the first careful cut, Thorik didn't flinch. The anesthesia had done its job, but the vet had warned that his vitals were weak. Gael held his breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't sure why he felt so invested, why the fate of a dog he had only met hours ago felt so damn important. Maybe it was because Thorik had chosen him. Maybe it was because he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a random case of an abandoned animal. Minutes passed like hours. Gael watched as Rowan used delicate instruments to carefully probe the wound. Then, suddenly, the vet's posture stiffened. "There it is," he murmured. His assistant leaned closer, adjusting the surgical light. Something small and metallic glinted under the open wound. Gael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was no ordinary injury. Rowan worked with precision, extracting the object carefully with a pair of forceps. As he lifted it into view, the room fell into silence. It wasn't a bullet. It was a device. Gael stepped closer, his pulse quickening. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice edged with tension. Rowan held the small metallic object between the tips of the forceps, studying it under the light. It was cylindrical, barely the size of a dime, with faint, almost unnoticeable etchings along its surface. His assistant let out a slow exhale. "That's not a normal microchip," she said quietly. "That's military grade." The words hit Gael like a gut punch. His mind reeled. Why the hell would a German shepherd be carrying a military-grade tracking device? His grip on the edge of the observation window tightened as a single thought surfaced through the chaos in his mind. Thorik wasn't just a lost dog. He was part of something much bigger. And now, someone would realize he was missing. Gael stared at the small metallic device resting in the sterile tray beside Thorik's unconscious body. The dim surgical light reflected off its smooth surface, revealing faint, almost imperceptible etchings, markings that didn't look random. They looked intentional. Dr. Rowan and his assistant exchanged uneasy glances, their postures tense. This wasn't just any foreign object. It was something dangerous. Gael's pulse thundered in his ears as his mind raced through the implications. A military-grade tracking chip inside a stray German shepherd? It didn't add up. Dogs were microchipped all the time, but this? This wasn't for identification. This was for surveillance. He had seen similar tech before, usually in cases involving black market operations, illegal dogfighting rings, or high-level security units. But what the hell was it doing inside Thorik? Dr. Rowan placed the device on a small sterile cloth, his brow furrowed. "We need to be careful," he muttered. "If this was active before, removing it may have set off an alert." Gail's stomach twisted at the thought. Had someone just realized Thorik was missing? He turned to the assistant. "Can you tell if it was transmitting?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "We'd need specialized equipment to check. But if it's military grade, whoever placed it didn't intend to lose track of him." Gael clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about Thorik anymore. Someone out there had gone to great lengths to keep an eye on this dog. And now, they'd know he was off the grid. His gut told him that whoever was behind this wouldn't let it go unanswered. He turned his gaze back to the sleeping puppy in the enclosure nearby. Thorik had risked everything to save it. Had he been running from someone? Escaping something? He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to one of his contacts, a former military specialist who dealt with classified tech. If anyone could identify the chip, it was him. But as Gael hit send, a sudden, chilling thought struck him. Had Thorik been tagged as an asset? A threat? A test subject? His eyes flickered back to the scars on the dog's body. What had he been put through? Dr. Rowan cleared his throat, pulling him back to the present. "Thorik made it through surgery, but he's still weak," he said, glancing at the monitors. "His fight isn't over." Gael nodded, his fists tightening. Neither was his. Because now, Thorik wasn't just a lost dog. He was a target. Gael sat in the dimly lit waiting room of the clinic, his elbows resting on his knees, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. The small metallic tracking device rested in a sealed evidence bag on the table in front of him, its smooth surface catching the glow of the overhead light. No matter how many times he tried to make sense of it, one truth remained: it didn't belong inside an ordinary dog. And that meant Thorik wasn't ordinary. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the screen, a message from his contact, Luis Vega, a former military intelligence officer. Gael had sent him a photo of the chip just an hour ago, hoping for some insight. The reply was brief but sent a chill through his spine. "Where did you find this? We need to talk. Now." Gael's fingers tightened around the phone. Vega wasn't the kind of guy to overreact. If this chip had rattled him, that meant it was a much bigger deal than Gael had initially thought. He quickly typed back. "Vet clinic. Pulled it from a dog. Thorik." Seconds later, the typing bubbles appeared. "I'm on my way. Don't let anyone near that chip. And keep your eyes open." Gael exhaled slowly, his instincts on high alert. Something about this was all wrong. He glanced toward the observation window where Thorik lay hooked up to monitors, still unconscious from the surgery. The puppy slept soundly in its enclosure, unaware of the storm brewing around it. Gael didn't know exactly what he had stumbled into, but one thing was clear: someone had been tracking Thorik. And now they knew he was gone. A sudden noise outside the clinic made him tense. The distant growl of an engine. The slow, deliberate sound of tires rolling across pavement. He turned toward the window, peering through the blinds. A black SUV sat idling across the street, its headlights off. He couldn't see inside, but his gut told him whoever was in that car wasn't there by accident. His fingers instinctively brushed against his holster. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. This was a warning. And if they had found the clinic this fast, whoever they were wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. Gael took one last glance at Thorik. No one was taking him. Not tonight. Not ever. Gael's pulse quickened as he studied the black SUV parked across the street. It hadn't moved. No lights, no engine revving, just sitting there like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His instincts screamed at him. Whoever was inside knew exactly what they were looking for. His grip tightened around his phone as another message from Vega came through. ETA 15 minutes. Don't engage. Gael scoffed under his breath. Easy for Vega to say. He wasn't the one standing in a dimly lit clinic with a half-dead dog, a helpless puppy, and the sinking feeling that things were about to escalate. He glanced back at the observation room. Thorik was still unconscious, his massive frame rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. The puppy whimpered softly in its enclosure, shifting in its sleep. They had no idea what kind of danger was closing in. Rowan entered the waiting area, wiping his hands on a towel. "Thorik's stable, but weak," he said. "He's got a long way to go before we know if he'll fully recover." Gael nodded but didn't look away from the window. Rowan followed his gaze and frowned. "Something wrong?" Gael hesitated before answering. He didn't want to pull the vet into this any more than necessary. "Might just be my imagination," he said. "But I think we're being watched." Rowan's expression darkened slightly. "You want me to call it in?" Gael shook his head. "Not yet. Let's not make a move until we know what we're dealing with." But deep down, he already knew. Whoever had put that chip inside Thorik was watching, waiting, and probably wondering why their tracker had gone dark. And that meant they wouldn't stay hidden for long. His phone vibrated again. "Vega. If they're already there, you need to move. Now." Gael's jaw clenched. This wasn't just surveillance. This was a hunt. And Thorik had just become their missing asset. Gael's grip tightened around his phone as he read Vega's message again. "If they're already there, you need to move. Now." The words sent a cold wave of realization through him. This wasn't just surveillance, this was a recovery mission. Whoever was in that SUV wasn't waiting for an opportunity. They were preparing to strike. He turned back toward the observation room. Thorik lay unconscious, his body still weak from surgery, completely vulnerable. The puppy shifted in its enclosure, letting out a faint whimper in its sleep. They had no idea the storm that was about to hit. Gael clenched his jaw. He had promised himself he wouldn't let anyone take them. And he damn well intended to keep that promise. Rowan noticed the tension in his posture. "Gael," he said cautiously, "if something's going on, I need to know." Gael exhaled sharply, his mind racing through possible next steps. If these people were bold enough to sit outside and watch, it was only a matter of time before they acted. And when they did, they wouldn't knock on the door and ask nicely. Finally, he turned to the vet. "I need you to lock all the doors," he said, his voice low but firm. "Anyone tries to come in, you call me first. No exceptions." Rowan hesitated but saw the seriousness in Gael's expression and nodded. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Gael glanced back at the window. The SUV was still there, but now its brake lights had flickered on. His pulse spiked. They were getting ready to move. So was he. "I don't know yet," Gael admitted, reaching for his holster, fingers brushing the grip of his sidearm. "But I have a feeling we're about to find out." Outside, the SUV's engine rumbled to life. The hunt had begun. The low rumble of the SUV's engine sent a ripple of tension through Gael's body. They were making their move. His grip instinctively tightened around his holster as he took a slow, steady breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help him now, but acting too late could cost him everything. From the observation room, Thorik remained unconscious, his breathing slow but steady. The puppy stirred in its enclosure, letting out a soft whimper, as if sensing the shift in the air. They were vulnerable, defenseless. And Gael knew that whoever was out there wouldn't care about that. If they were coming, they weren't coming to negotiate. Rowan locked the front door, his face pale but determined. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he asked. Gael's eyes remained on the SUV. The brake lights glowed red in the darkness, the vehicle idling just beyond the clinic's entrance. He could almost feel the weight of their gaze from behind the tinted windows. They were waiting for something or someone. Then, suddenly, the passenger door opened. A man in a dark jacket stepped out, moving with a calculated precision that sent every alarm in Gail's mind blaring. He wasn't some random bystander. He was trained. The way he carried himself, the subtle way his eyes scanned the building. This wasn't his first time tracking something. Gail's heartbeat slammed against his ribs as the man approached the clinic. There was no hesitation in his movements. He knew exactly where he was going. Exactly what he wanted. Gael could feel Rowan's questioning stare beside him, but he didn't turn. His focus was locked on the approaching threat. His phone buzzed. Vega. Gael barely glanced at the screen before reading the text. They're not here to talk. Get out now. Too late. The man reached for the door handle. Gael drew his gun. Gail's heartbeat pounded in his ears as the man's fingers curled around the clinic's door handle. His grip tightened on his gun. Everything about this felt wrong. The way they had waited, the way they had moved with careful precision. These weren't just random thugs. They were professionals. The SUV idling outside, the way they had positioned themselves, it all pointed to a well-executed operation. And Gael had the distinct gut-wrenching feeling that Thorik wasn't their first retrieval. Without hesitation, he raised his weapon, aiming straight for the man's chest. His voice came out sharp and unwavering. Step away from the door. Now. The man froze, his fingers lingering on the handle. He didn't flinch, didn't panic. He simply turned his head toward Gael, his expression unreadable. This wasn't a man caught off guard. This was a man assessing a situation. Calculating. Deciding his next move. Gael had seen this look before. It was the look of someone who wasn't afraid to kill. Slowly, deliberately, the man lifted both hands, his posture deceptively relaxed. "No need for that, officer," he said, his voice smooth and even. Too even. His dark gaze flickered toward the observation room, toward Thorik's unconscious form. Gael followed his line of sight, and his grip on the gun tightened. So, that was it. They weren't here for him. They were here for the dog. Gael's jaw clenched. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head slightly, smirking, as if Gael had asked the most obvious question in the world. "I think you already know." His voice was laced with something almost amused, but Gael could hear the quiet threat beneath it. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, this wasn't just about reclaiming a lost asset. It was about control. About making sure Thorik never left their grasp again. Before Gael could respond, the SUV's engine rumbled loudly, and the back door swung open. Another man stepped out, taller, broader, his shoulders squared like a battering ram. His boots hit the pavement with weight, and the way he adjusted his stance sent every alarm in Gael's mind blaring. Reinforcements. This wasn't just a scare tactic. They were preparing for a confrontation. Gael adjusted his stance, keeping his gun steady. His mind raced. If he fired, it would escalate. If he hesitated, they would take Thorik. The first man's smirk faded slightly as he took a slow step forward. Gael saw it then, a subtle shift in his posture, a silent signal to his partner. His stomach coiled with tension. They weren't walking away. And now, neither was he. Gael's finger rested against the trigger, his body coiled with tension. He had been in standoffs before, but this was different. This wasn't just about stopping a crime, it was about stopping something much worse. These men weren't ordinary criminals. They were professionals, calm, trained, methodical. And that made them far more dangerous. The first man, the one who had smirked earlier, studied Gael carefully. His hands still raised but his posture unreadable. He wasn't afraid. No, this wasn't a man who panicked under pressure. He was waiting, calculating, looking for the slightest hesitation. The second man, taller and broader, stood a few feet behind him, his stance squared and solid. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved much, but Gael could tell he was the real threat. He was the muscle, the executioner. Inside the clinic, the soft beeping of the machines monitoring Thorik's fragile condition served as a cruel reminder that the dog lying unconscious behind that glass couldn't fight for himself. But Gael could, and he would. His mind raced. If they made a move toward the entrance, he would have to make a choice. And he already knew what that choice would be. The first man took a slow, measured breath. "You don't need to do this, officer," he said smoothly, his voice level. Too level. "This isn't your fight. Step aside, and no one gets hurt." His eyes flickered to Gael's badge, as if emphasizing his point. A warning disguised as a courtesy. Gael didn't move. He saw through the lie. Even if he stepped aside, there was no way they would let a witness walk away. And even if they did, he wasn't about to abandon Thorik to whatever these men had planned for him. "You should leave," Gael said, his tone firm, unwavering. He was done playing games. "Because if you take another step toward that door, I will put you down." The man's smirk finally vanished. His expression hardened, a flicker of something cold and ruthless flashing in his eyes. Gael saw it, the shift in posture, the silent signal to the man behind him. A heartbeat later, the second man moved, reaching into his jacket. Gael fired first. The gunshot shattered the silence, its deafening echo bouncing off the clinic walls like a warning shot to the night itself. Gael didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess. His instincts had made the decision before his mind even had time to process it. The second man, the one reaching into his jacket, jerked back as the bullet tore through his shoulder, his body twisting from the force of the impact. A sharp grunt of pain escaped him, but he didn't fall. Instead, he stumbled back a few steps, gripping his wound, his expression a mixture of shock and seething anger. These men weren't the type to go down easily. The first man's smirk vanished instantly. His body moved with trained precision, lunging sideways as his hand shot toward his own weapon. Gael tracked the movement, adjusting his aim, but before he could fire again, the SUV's engine roared to life. Headlights blazed on, flooding the clinic entrance with an intense, blinding light. Gael's pupils constricted, his vision momentarily overwhelmed by the harsh glare. It was a calculated move, a tactical distraction. And it worked. Behind him, Rowan let out a shaky breath. "Gael, what the hell are you doing?" he hissed, but Gael didn't move, didn't waver. His focus remained locked on the two men outside, their carefully planned approach now unraveling. The second man, though bleeding heavily from his shoulder, stayed on his feet, his jaw clenched in silent fury. The first man, however, had already adapted. His demeanor shifted from confidence to something else, something colder. Slowly, deliberately, the first man straightened, his hands no longer raised. He met Gael's stare with an expression of quiet, lethal calculation. "That was a mistake, officer," he said, his voice eerily calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "Not a threat. A promise." Gael didn't lower his gun. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. The only mistake was thinking you could walk in here and take what isn't yours. His words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning. The first man exhaled, slow, measured, almost disappointed. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the SUV. The second man hesitated for only a second before following, his good hand pressing against his wounded shoulder, his eyes burning with silent rage. The black SUV peeled away from the curb, its tires screeching softly against the asphalt. Gael watched it disappear into the night, his muscles still coiled with tension. This wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. They had come here expecting an easy retrieval, expecting no resistance. Now, they had a reason to come back stronger. And when they did, Gael would be ready. The air in the clinic felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of the standoff. Gael stood frozen for a moment, his gun still firm in his grasp, his heart pounding in a steady, controlled rhythm. The SUV had vanished into the darkness, but the threat wasn't gone. It had simply stepped into the shadows, waiting. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't over. Not even close. Behind him, Rowan exhaled sharply, the weight of what had just happened settling in. "You just shot someone," he muttered, shaking his head, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and anxiety. Gael didn't look at him. "And if I hadn't?" he asked, his tone flat, unreadable. The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Rowan knew the answer. If Gael hadn't fired first, those men would have walked right through that door and taken Thorik. And they wouldn't have left any witnesses. His gaze drifted toward the observation room, where Thorik lay motionless on the examination table. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a fragile reminder that, despite everything, he was still alive, for now. The tiny puppy stirred inside its enclosure, letting out a small, restless whimper. Gael clenched his jaw. They had no idea how close they had just come to being taken. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Vega. Gael pulled it out, already expecting what the message would say. "They'll be back. You need to move him. Now." Gael's grip tightened around the phone. He knew that already. Those men had left too easily. They were regrouping, calculating their next move. The next time they showed up, they wouldn't come with fake smiles and smooth words. They'd come prepared, armed, ready to kill. He turned to Rowan, who was still standing by the locked entrance, looking shaken but alert. "How soon can Thorik be moved?" Rowan hesitated, glancing toward the unconscious shepherd through the glass. "He's weak," he admitted. "Moving him too soon could—" He stopped himself, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "If we don't have a choice, I can stabilize him enough for transport." Gael nodded, his decision made. There was no time to second-guess. Whoever those men were, they weren't giving up. They had left tonight because they weren't expecting resistance. But now, Gael had just given them a reason to come back stronger. And when they did, he wouldn't be here waiting for them. Thorik was leaving tonight. And Gael was going with him. Gael's pulse pounded in his ears as he scanned the room, his mind racing through every possible scenario. They had to move now. Staying here was a death sentence. The men from the SUV weren't gone, not really. They were circling, waiting, watching. They'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't come with warnings. He turned to Rowan, who was hastily grabbing medical supplies, his hands moving quickly but not carelessly. The vet understood. He might not know exactly what they were up against, but he knew enough to realize that if they didn't leave, they wouldn't live to regret it. "How long do we have?" Rowan asked, his voice tight, urgent. Gael glanced at the clinic's front entrance, half expecting the door to burst open, half expecting the glow of headlights sweeping across the windows. His gut told him what he didn't want to admit: the men outside weren't gone. They had just pulled back, regrouping. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. His fingers curled into fists as he forced himself to focus. "Minutes," he muttered. "Maybe less." He reached into his pocket and fired off a message to Vega. "We're leaving. Now." Rowan was already at Thorik's side, adjusting the four-line, ensuring the straps securing him to the gurney weren't too tight. The German shepherd still hadn't woken up. His breathing was slow, steady, but his body remained motionless, the weight of everything he had endured keeping him unconscious. "He's stable for now," Rowan said, though his tone was far from reassuring. "But if his vitals drop, we'll have to stop." Gael clenched his jaw. Stopping wasn't an option. If they hesitated for even a moment, Thorik would be lost. And Gael knew, deep in his gut, that if these men got their hands on the shepherd again, he wouldn't be coming back. His gaze flicked to the tiny puppy, nestled in a blanket inside its enclosure. It was awake now, its round, trusting eyes blinking up at him, completely unaware of how much danger it was in. Thorik had risked everything to get it here. Gael wasn't about to let that sacrifice be in vain. He reached down, wrapping the small pup in a towel before tucking it securely inside his jacket. The warmth of its tiny body pressed against his chest, its heartbeat quick but steady. Gael inhaled sharply. It was so small, so vulnerable. And yet, it had already survived more than most ever would. Rowan gave a sharp nod as he finished securing the last strap on the gurney. He's as ready as he'll ever be. Gael pulled his gun, checking the chamber before gripping the gurney's handle. His muscles were tight, his senses sharpened. No more hesitation. No more second-guessing. As they pushed through the back door into the cold, silent night, Gael felt it in his gut. This wasn't just an escape. This was a chase. And they were the prey. The cold night air bit into Gael's skin, sending a sharp jolt of adrenaline through his veins as he and Rowan burst through the back exit of the clinic. The narrow alley behind the building was shrouded in darkness, broken only by the dim orange glow of a distant street lamp. Every instinct in Gael's body screamed at him. Keep moving, don't stop, don't look back. They had no time. The men from the SUV would return, and when they did, it wouldn't be a warning. It would be an execution. The wheels of Thorik's gurney rattled violently against the uneven pavement, the old metal frame groaning under the weight of the unconscious dog. Rowan was struggling to keep control, his breath coming in sharp, labored gasps. "Where's the car?" he hissed, voice laced with panic. He wasn't used to this, running for his life, knowing death was just a few steps behind them. But Gael was. He had lived this kind of danger before. Gael's eyes locked onto his SUV, parked further down the alley where he had left it earlier. It was their only way out. He grabbed his keys, hitting the remote. The headlights flashed once, the locks disengaging with a soft click. "Move," he ordered, voice tight, unwavering. He wasn't going to let fear slow them down. They had seconds, maybe less. They rushed toward the vehicle, but Gael felt it before he heard it. That electric shift in the air, that gut-wrenching sensation of being watched. A presence. A second before the sound reached him, he already knew what was coming. Headlights flared at the other end of the alley. A second SUV. And it was coming straight for them. "Go, go, go!" Gael shouted, grabbing the gurney and forcing it forward. The low, menacing roar of an accelerating engine filled the alley, growing louder, closer. The black vehicle surged forward like a predator closing in on its prey. Gael wrenched the SUV's back door open, muscles burning as he and Rowan lifted Thorik inside. The dog's body was limp, still unmoving, for lines tangling as they fought to settle him in place. The puppy squirmed inside Gael's jacket, letting out a weak, fearful whimper as if sensing the mounting danger. Just as Gael slammed the driver's door shut, tires screeched behind him. The second SUV skidded sideways, blocking the alley's only exit. Doors flew open. Dark figures emerged, shadows in the night, their silhouettes sharp against the glare of their own headlights. And in their hands, weapons. Gael's breath came slow, controlled, but his heart pounded like a war drum inside his chest. He wrapped his fingers around his gun, knuckles white. They weren't getting out of this without a fight. Gael's grip tightened around his gun, his knuckles going white as he took in the scene unfolding in front of him. 4 men. Armed. Ready. They stood between him and the only way out, their silhouettes sharp against the SUV's blinding headlights. The hum of the idling engine filled the narrow alley, a quiet but deadly reminder that this was no bluff. They had come prepared to end this. One way or another. Rowan sat frozen in the passenger seat, his breath ragged. "They're not going to let us leave, are they?" he whispered, his fingers gripping the dashboard. Gael didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. These men weren't here for a standoff. They were here to take Thorik back, at any cost. And if Gael and Rowan got in the way? Collateral damage. A figure stepped forward. The leader. The same man Gael had confronted outside the clinic, his sharp gaze flickering over the SUV with eerie calm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was calculating, measuring the situation, looking for weakness. "You made a mistake, officer," he said, his voice even controlled. "I gave you a chance to walk away." He exhaled slowly, like a teacher disappointed in a student. "But now," his head tilted slightly, "now you're involved." Gael lifted his gun higher, his aim steady. "I was involved the second you put a bullet in that dog." His voice was quiet, but it carried enough weight to fill the entire alley. "So, I'll say this once." His jaw tightened. "Step aside." Silence. A single heartbeat of hesitation. Then, a flicker of movement. Gael fired first. The explosion of gunfire ripped through the alley, deafening in the tight space. Gael's shot hit the first man square in the shoulder, spinning him backward as chaos erupted. Rowan ducked, shouting something, but Gael barely heard him over the roaring adrenaline in his veins. The second man raised his weapon, too slow. Gael squeezed the trigger again, a perfect shot, center mass. The man collapsed. The remaining two fired back. Sparks flew as bullets slammed into the SUV's hood and windshield. Glass shattered. Gael dropped low, his body moving on instinct. They were pinned. Then, a sound, a deep, guttural growl. "Thorik." Gael's breath caught as the German shepherd staggered up from the gurney. His body was still weak, but his eyes? Sharp, focused, lethal. The moment he saw the men outside, his posture changed. No longer a broken animal, no longer a victim. Now, he was something else entirely. Gael saw it in his stance, in his expression. He remembered them. And he wasn't afraid. With a final, strained breath, Thorik lunged.